get yourselves comfortable. So our next speaker is Stephanie Eckles, all the way from the US. So she is, again, somebody I've admired in the CSS world for a long time. She's a prolific writer. I was lucky enough recently to work with her on a series of articles for SitePoint on modern responsive design on CSS. Which, you know, I say I worked with her. She did most of the work. I just got to look over her articles and suggest a few things, and that was about my extent of it. But it's a fantastic series, so do check that out. She's also the side project queen, I think it's fair to say. She has created loads of awesome side projects, which include modern CSS, loads of helpful tips on using modern CSS features, some of which we've already seen today. Small CSS, which is modern CSS snippets that you can use in your projects. Style Stage, which is very cool. It's like a modern CSS Zen garden. I still need to do one of those as well. You can create your own version of that as well. So get involved, and loads of projects. Loads of tutorials on 11T as well, which I know a lot of you use. So that's super useful. So as I say, she's an expert in modern CSS, so I'm really looking forward to hearing her dig into using CSS in practical cases with dynamic components. So please welcome to the stage Stephanie Eckles.
Hello, everyone. I know your heads are already just absolutely full of so many wonderful things shared by the other speakers, obviously more to come later today. But I'm hoping to impart some practical techniques that you can use to bring what you're learning into your projects, hopefully to consider for new projects, and really just aim to leave you inspired to begin using modern CSS to create scalable, future-friendly web projects. So at a high level, here's the topics we're going to be covering today, including CSS reset additions, project architecture updates, theming and branding, responsive layout utilities, and most of our time will be spent building components with modern CSS. So since the early days of CSS, there's been a convention to sort of tame cross-browser styling inconsistencies, commonly known as a CSS reset. And this refers to a group of rules that do things like remove default spacing or enforce inheritance of certain properties like font styles. But it's also grown more flexible in definition, and some folks use it as a place to put sort of more global overrides. So we're going to cover a few handy rules that I now put in my reset to take advantage of modern CSS features. Now, a really great thing about the rules we're going to cover is that they are definitely progressive enhancements. And so they don't strictly require fallbacks for these particular set of rules. And so that means if they're supported in a browser, awesome, that's great. And if they're not, we have little to no impact on the user experience. So for the first one, I like to set a baseline of common styles for default links. So I'm kind of scoping default links to those without a class, having the assumption that those are intended to be our underlined regular text links. So the update here is to use a relative thickness for our underline and to increase the underline offset. The visual outcome may be minor, but I think it improves legibility in certain contexts, especially when you have a list of links in close proximity. Extra little bonus tip in here is the max function. And the function that it's serving in this particular rule is ensuring that when we do that adjustment on the underline, that it's not going to be less than 1 pixel, because the browser is going to be choosing the larger computed style, whether that's the M value or 1 pixel. An exciting cross-browser update as of March 2022 was a switch of the default focus behavior. This is across our evergreen browsers to use what's known as focus visible by default. Now, whereas the focus state applies no matter how an element may receive focus, focus visible only produces a visible focus state based on heuristics. Okay, so practically speaking, that means that users who normally use a mouse as their input are not going to see a visible focus on interactive elements, but users who might use a keyboard and access interactive elements through tabbing will see a visible focus style. So as for our reset, that means that our visible focus styles, we're going to just go ahead and attach those only to the focus visible state. And in this role, I've used custom properties to set the various outline attributes. This allows creating a common baseline for our focus styles while allowing overrides as needed. You might be less familiar with the outline offset property, and this is going to define distance between the element and the outline. A neat thing about this is we can also provide a negative offset to pull the outline into the component, which we're going to take advantage of later on. Now, if you're interested, if this is new to you, have a pretty quick article you can check out. I promise that's not a tracking link. It's just to help you grab that in a few seconds. All right, so the last two additions to my reset have to do with improving scroll position for targeted or focused elements. And using the scroll padding properties, we can adjust the scroll position in relation to the element. This padding space does not actually affect layout. It's only going to impact the offset of the scroll position. And in this rule, the target selector matches when an element is the target of an anchor link, or also known as a document fragment. And the scroll padding block start, I'm also trying to work on switching my own brain to logical properties, but this will allow for room between the target and, in most scenarios, the top of the viewport. So when you're dealing with elements like sticky headers and things, you can use this property to get this space and not have that overlap. On the other side, for focused elements, we can use scroll padding block end, and this allows for room between the focused element and likely the bottom of the viewport. This really helps in tracking that visible focus state as something is coming through. There are inconsistencies in browsers on whether or not a scroll position will be adjusted if that focus element is at the bottom of the viewport. Now, again, this is not forcing in extra padding, so if it happens to be the actual end, like in your footer, it's not going to create generated space there. So both useful for sticky elements and also improving a little bit of accessibility. So now we've moved on to project architecture, and two features I'm actually shocked we haven't heard about yet, with the potential to strongly impact your project architecture: nesting and cascade layers. So native nesting began to arrive as of Chromium 1.12, Safari 16.5, and super newly, like last week, Firefox Nightly. Thank you, Brahmas, for highlighting that. For those who have used a preprocessor like SAS or less, the rules of using nesting are going to be familiar, but there are some key differences. We're just going to do a really high breeze over of what those differences are to help you out if you choose to start using nesting. Now, at present, a nested rule must begin with a symbol. That means you can't directly nest a element selector, so that's the first example. And with nesting, as with some preprocessors, we also have the ampersand character available. So the second portion here shows you how to include an element selector. We're just going to prefix it with the, not prefix, but prepend it with the ampersand character. Alternatively, selectors such as is or where can begin the rule since they include a symbol, as can regular class selectors, attributes, and any of the other combinators, as they're all considered symbols. A possible gotcha with nesting selectors is that the compound result creates descendant selectors. In other words, a space character is going to be inserted between your nested selector and your top level selector. So if you intend to have those be combined, you're going to want to use that ampersand and place it very directly with that nested selector. So you can see the difference between the two types of nested selectors here. Use of the ampersand also allows selectors for pseudo classes and pseudo elements, which is super handy. This is one reason I've started using it. And by the way, if you're wondering if nesting is safe to use, at the moment we do have build tools such as Lightning CSS that will help you pre-compile these nested rules until your browser targets show that your support is sufficient, and those can be left in your style sheets. Now, in a coordinated cross-browser rollout in early 2020, the new @rule of @layer was made available across Chromium 99, Safari 15.4, and Firefox 97. This @rule is how to manage the C and CSS, the cascade, and specifically two features, specificity and order of appearance. That's important because those are the last two factors a browser considers when trying to decide which style to apply. So using @layer, we can define groups of rule sets with a predetermined order, and that's going to help reduce the likelihood of conflicts. Being able to assign this order largely removes the need to use things like important. And it enables easier overrides of inherited styles from third-party or framework systems. While we can't cover cascade layers in depth, we're going to, again, do sort of a flyover tool, since they're definitely a consideration for your project architecture. By the way, any complaints about how much I'm about to say layer can be directed to Miriam. But here are the critical rules to understand. And we will do some examples to help reinforce these rules here. So the initial order of layers defines the priority order of layer. So priority order is going to increase as your priority increases as you go in order. For example, the first layer has less priority than the last layer. Also, less nested layered styles have priority over deeper nested layered styles. And unlayered styles have the highest priority over layered styles. So in this example, we have the initial layer given as global, followed by typography. However, when we go to add the styles, we've actually listed typography first above the global layer. But as you might be able to notice, our paragraph is in fact blue, as defined in our typography layer, and that's because of that initial order definition. Also, we have a nested layer within typography of colors, and it's given an additional color for the paragraph, but as we learned, the less nested styles are going to have priority over the more nested styles. Finally, in our typography layer, we had removed margins, but our one style out here that is unlayered is going to have the highest priority over layered styles. Now, the one rule we didn't get to cover today is how important does affect the cascade. So I encourage you to take a note down on that, as that will be something to look up later. Now, as with many newer features, there's so much room for experimentation, and best practices or standards of use have not really been established. So decisions on whether to even include cascade layers, what to name them, or how to order them are going to be very project dependent. Here's a layer order I've kind of been trying out, helped by a poll that I ran a few months ago on Mastodon. And something that I think is important to note is that moving to cascade layers can be a little tricky. There is a polyfill available. However, @rules cannot be presently detected through @support. So the second block that I have on screen is a way that you can detect support using JavaScript. All right, so for the remainder of the examples, we'll be building up components and branding for our imaginary project here, Jabberwocky. And when starting a new project, whether it's large or small, there are 3 features I immediately began using. The first of those is custom properties, also known as CSS variables. This is not new, but I feel it is still lesser used, which is kind of proven out in the latest Web Almanac statistics. So we'll begin by placing the brand colors as custom properties within the root. And also, you'll notice we are starting to use layers, so this is within our theme layer. You may wish to put font sizes or other tokens that are going to be reused across your project, also in both this layer and as custom properties. And later, we will elevate some of our component properties to this layer. We'll also continue to inject custom properties throughout our component styles to develop an API for them. So we're going to talk about custom properties a lot as well today. Now that we have a brand and color palette, it's time to add the other two features. First up is color scheme, which allows us to inform the browser whether the initial appearance is light or dark, or assign a priority if both are supported. The priority order comes from the order the values are listed. So light, dark gives light the priority. Use of color scheme may affect scroll bars and also adjust the appearance of input fields. And unless you provide other overrides, it can also affect the background color and color properties. And while we're setting it on the HTML, you can localize this to a specific component or section of a layout. The second property is accent color, which applies your selected color to the form inputs of checkboxes, radio buttons, range, and progress elements. For radio buttons and checkboxes, this is going to apply to the selected state, or the check state, excuse me. And this is an impactful step towards retheming what are usually really tricky to style form inputs. And you might find these are a sufficient solution as opposed to restyling and recreating a whole new set of rules for these. So I am going to jump over here to DevTools, and I want to show you what color scheme specifically is doing for us. So let me get situated here. If I go, I'm in Chrome Canary since I am using a lot of super modern stuff. But it's available outside of Canary as well. And I apologize, I can't make the little menu larger. But this is going to allow us to choose our color preference, color scheme preference. So while it's defaulting to my system right now, which happens to be light for the daytime, I'll switch it to dark. And you may notice how the inputs have absolutely adapted. And because I've removed any overrides, the color has also adapted. It also makes our accent color pop a little better in this particular theme. I'll move it back to light for the difference there. Let me close DevTools before we move on. Sorry, I keep losing my mouse when I switch between screens. All right. So there is so much we could cover in regards to CSS layout. Whenever I talk about grid, it's like choosing my favorite child. But we are going to look at two utilities that I put in pretty much all of my projects these days. And beyond defining display grid, the magic of this first rule is going to be in the grid template columns rule, for which we'll use the grid-specific function of repeat. The first bit of magic here is going to be using the autofit keyword. And this keyword tells grid to create as many columns as can fit, given the sizing definition, which will come next. And for that, we'll use the grid-specific function of min-max. And this accepts two values, a minimum and a maximum. And for the minimum, we'll include the extra CSS function of min. The reason is we're asking the browser to choose the smaller of the computed options, and this allows spaces that may be less than our static value, which here happens to be 30 ch. When we get to narrower spaces than that, it'll switch to the 100%, which becomes smaller computed value, and still allow the space to collapse. And then for the maximum, we will use 1FR, and that's going to, in most cases, allow the items to share the space equitably, and we get a nice little grid like this, where those elements drop down and create new rows once they can no longer share that space, and that's based on that 30 ch in this particular example. So to improve customization, we are going to drop in a custom property to define the minimum allowed style. Let me expand that so you can see it. And this will function as sort of a breakpoint for the column. And for the most flexibility, I also like to include a custom property to allow overriding the gap as well. Now, since this solution uses CSS grid, the grid children are destined to stay in that grid formation. You see that as they drop to new rows, they're still staying in the implicit columns created from the prior rows. So if we want to have those children be able to expand a little bit more, we're going to switch our solution to flex. So especially in the case when you have an odd number of children in the grid, you may want to allow them to expand and fill any leftover space. And again, we're going to switch to Flexbox here. And our Flexbox grid utility shares two features in common with the CSS grid utility for a minimum column size and a gap size. So we're going to go ahead and set up two custom properties. Note that we've elevated those to our theme layer. And then we'll kick off our Flexbox utility as well as update the grid utility to use those values. Now continuing with our Flexbox utility, let me expand that again for us. We just have our gap in place, so we need to go ahead and define display flex and flex wrap, wrap being important so that children can be dropped down to a new row as needed. But the difference between Flexbox and grid is that in grid, the parent controls styling of the children, and in flex, the children handle their own sizing. So since our utility doesn't know what those children will be, we'll go ahead and use the universal selector to apply the Flexbox sizing. We're going to use the flex shorthand, and we're going to allow our elements to grow and shrink using a value of 1. And then with the flex, for the flex basis, we'll apply that minimum value that we just applied and elevated to our theme layer. And now at this point, you'll notice that as items drop, especially in our uneven number of grid items here, those items that are, when we get to 2 on a row, those are sharing space, and when we get to 1 on the row, those are allowed to expand the whole way, and that's based on the flex grow property. Shortly, we'll use container size queries throughout our components, and we'll also take advantage of placing those in our layout grids. So something I'm kind of trying out is going ahead and assigning containers for my Flexbox layout grid and CSS grid children. So in this rule, we're doing a nice grouping of both those utilities with is, we're addressing their direct children, and not only are we assigning containers, but also we're opening up an API with our custom property, and this allows us to override the name of the container contextually, so when we get to specific components or specific instances on your page. And that allows you to be even more explicit about which container they're querying, which we learned a bit more about this morning as well. So we've reached the first of our 4 components that we're going to look at. And the first up, the classic, we got to do a button. And so our button here, this is kind of our little nice mock-up, but the variations we'll support are an actual button element, a link element styled as a button, one that includes a text and icon, and the reverse of icon and text, and also icon only. Now there's some reset properties beyond the scope of this demo, but what we're going to focus on is the API and the different states of styling our button. So the API is created by first assigning a custom property that's actually undefined. And that enables us to tap in and adjust those styles later for maybe different states and various other properties. And we follow that by using the fallback to assign properties for the default state. Our color is kind of light here, but it's a light purple that's been applied. And then we'll move on to the different variations we have present. So next we'll address the presence of an icon within the button. Detecting presence is a very special capability of the super modern feature has, which is my favorite, and we're going to talk a lot about. With has, we can look inside of the button and see if it has an icon. And if it does, we'll apply some nice flex properties in this case. Now, because we're using has, we've actually increased the specificity. That's something to be aware of. So we're going to also wrap this has clause with where. Where is nulling the specificity to 0, and now our rule computes to the same as a class, which can be handy as we continue to do overrides of the variations. Next up, for our icon-only buttons, in our markup, we have an element with the class inclusively hidden. And that allows removing the visible label while leaving an accessible label for assistive technology like screen readers. So we can look for that class to apply a rounded appearance for our icon-only button. Next, for buttons without icons, we want to set a minimum inline size and center the text. So we will now combine not with has to create a selector that basically says buttons where there is not an icon. And as we noted earlier, we have two different variations here. So you can see the top two have, the difference is they now have a little bit of a default size exposed. Finally, we have the case of our buttons that are not icon only. So we're going to again look for that inclusively hidden class and apply some default styling on all the rest of the variations. We've given ourselves one more custom property to tap into for the button padding. So a nice little API created in very little selectors. Now, while the initial appearance is complete, we need to handle for two states, hover and focus. For the hover state, we're going to tap into those custom properties and adjust for our colors. And for focus visible, we'll tap into the API we created within our reset. Notably, we are going to use a negative outline offset to pull that outline into our button, which we can do a little preview on. So there's our focus state. We have both a dashed appearance and placed it into our button. All right, so now we're to our second component, which is cards. Here's a little preview of what we're going to end up with. We have sort of our default small card view, a wider style with larger text, a new state of a card, and also we want to handle the focus visible state. We're going to start from some baseline styles that provide the basic positioning of our cards and, for all accounts, are pretty usable. They don't match our mockup, but it's a really important consideration that we talk about progressive enhancement of this is a usable experience that we're going to layer our modern styles on top of to get to our ideal experience. So we will start with the new variation. And there's two details that change, both based on the presence of that little new tag that's in that first card. And we're going to be detecting presence. So that cues us in to know that we're going to be dealing with has again. So we're going to be checking if our card has the tag element. And our first detail is adding an additional border. We're actually using a little box shadow hack here to create that secondary border within our card. The other detail is to adjust the display of the headline, which that new tag resides in. And for that, we'll create a nice little grouping with is to look for either an H2 or H3 element. And since we'll be adding more headline styling soon, we're also going to try out nesting. And the rule here is to check, does either the H2 or H3 have the tag? And we're giving it a bit of grid styling if so. Now, our baseline card styles include a method of having the whole card surface clickable, but the link itself is only around the headline text. However, we need to handle appropriately for the focus state of our card. So we can achieve an outlined appearance of our cards that have been focused without using any positioning hackery by using the focus within pseudoclass. With focus within, we can style a parent element when a child is in a focus state. So this lets us add a regular outlined appearance to the card without having to have a pseudo element or other tricks. Now, this still leaves us the default outline on the link, and we're going to switch that to use a transparent outline. The reason we're not going to remove it entirely is that it may be useful for users using a forced colors mode. If you're not familiar, the very short summary is that it swaps our defined colors to a very limited color palette. And interestingly, in that mode, transparent is replaced with a solid color. The final state we'll add is to include a text underline on the actual link when the card is hovered or has visible focus. And this is going to just help identify the purpose as a link. So there's our link coming in. And also I currently have the second card focused, third card focused. Since we've placed our cards in our Flexbox grid utility, they already seem to be responsive. But if you recall, our mockup here has a wide card variant. And it's definitely different than simply having the card layout stretched out. But if you also recall, we have already preset up our grid so that the grid elements are already defined as containers. And just as another refresher, the containers around the card elements currently have the default name of grid item. And additionally, on this particular layout, we have defined containment around the grid, and we've given that the name of layout container. So one level of our container queries will be attached to how wide the entire layout is, and the other will respond to the inline size of the unique flex child, which will be the grid item container. As Miriam helped us learn as well, a container cannot style it itself, so that's why we've had to set ourselves up in this way, and why we haven't made the actual card element itself a container. But since it's the direct child, it's going to be equivalent to the inline size of the flex item. All right, let's get some code on screen. So with this, we will assign the wide variation styles when the inline size of the grid item is greater than 40 ch. And these styles will switch the grid orientation into columns instead of the default of rows, which places the number and icon on the starting side. And then we've added some alignment as well as gap. And for the card itself, the gap has slipped in another nice benefit. We got some container query units in here, in this case 5 CQI, roughly equivalent to, I guess is equivalent to 5% of the calculated inline size. This is nice because it's going to expand for larger spaces and shrink for smaller layouts. The last layout we have will be based on how much room the whole entire card grid has available. So we'll switch. I expected that to happen. I had it fail on my screen. It doesn't always like to, it's live updating. It doesn't always like to apply the styles right away for container queries when it's live updated. But the switch will be to add this aspect ratio. And we're only doing that when our overall grid is above, let me make that wider so you can see it, above 70 ch. Now, as you can see, we also need to jump down and unset that for the wider card styles. But overall, if I expand this back out again, we get to the point where it switches to use that aspect ratio, but it's only going to allow that appearance when our entire grid is above a certain size. Now, it is possible to have a little break in our aspect ratio, although overall aspect ratio is forgiving. So if we give it a little more content, chocolate, cheese, sorry, it's before lunch. But you can see we did have a little bit of a break in aspect ratio. A unique thing about it is that it is forgiving. It is going to respond to our content size unless you have an additional dimension property. But in this case, our Flexbox sort of explicit or extrinsic sizing isn't quite strong enough to contain that overflow. But that's fine. We'll just give it a max inline size. So when we have content like this that exceeds what would be allowed from the aspect ratio, it's still going to be allowed to expand. And yes, so that is our container queries for our card. Now, according to our mockup, the last adjustment that we need to make is to increase the font size as the card becomes wider. We're going to use a method that I think is pretty popular at this point, but we're going to be using clamp. Again, we're scoping this to our headline only. And clamp accepts 3 values: a minimum, an ideal value, and a maximum value. So in order for this to be what we have come to know as fluid typography, we're using the container query inline unit, and that means that for more narrow cards, our font size will be smaller, and for larger cards, it will increase in size. Now, a neat thing about container queries is that all elements are style containers by default. That means there's actually no need to wrap a rule with a container in order to use container query units. They are available to all elements. It will affect how they behave, however. But one last modern feature we're going to use before we move on from our cards is the super modern, as in only in Chromium at the moment, feature of text wrap balance. We got a little preview from Una yesterday. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that to our cards. Get that in there. And let me shrink this down so you can kind of see more of an example if we get more of these to wrap. So that's the appearance with text wrap balance, and it's going to flip between. So kind of watch how those move across the rows. But it's a super good example of a progressive enhancement. Great when it works, not going to cause too much of an issue if it doesn't. One thing to note about it, however, is that balancing does not change the actual computed element's width. So in some cases, it may cause a little bit of extra unwanted space. As noted, text wrap balance is experimental, but clamp is super, super well supported. All right, now onto our pagination component. And I'm not sure how much time I have left, so hopefully we're doing okay. And this is going to benefit from container size queries as well. And if I show you our preview here, you'll note that we have kind of 3 stages where we're going to be managing the visibility of elements. The appearance that we currently have for our baseline styles assumes that most narrow context. That's kind of a practice I have been going forward with for container queries, but just in light of keeping in mind our fallbacks and the idea of working up towards our ideal behavior and appearance. And also, it may be useful to note the outline of the HTML markup. So you can kind of see the arrangement and way that we have 2 links on the either side of the pagination list, and also importantly that we are using spans inside of our left and right, or previous and next, so that we can hide the label as one level of our styles. So first, we're going to define containment for the pagination container so that we can actually query within it. And the styles for our default view have already hidden the list itself and the navigation labels. So for our first level, we're going to bring back the navigation labels, and that gives us our middle appearance, which we can already see on screen because we have enough room for it. And following that, we'll have a size query to center the hide the pagination label and reveal the full pagination list. And we'll just do a little proof that those are kicking in. Good deal. Now, while the pagination happens smoothly for the current list of items, we do have a potential problem. Eventually, that pagination list could grow much larger than 10 items. And this may lead to overflow if our container is not quite wide enough for that scenario. So, to help manage that condition, we'll be bringing back has and using it to create quantity queries. So this means modifying styles based on the number of elements. Our goal here is to keep that medium appearance if the pagination component has more than 10 items. So for checking for that quantity, we'll use has and nth child to look for the 11th item. And if the 11th item exists, that means we have more than 10 items. Now, we must place this rule within that container query for our larger size so that it applies at the correct time and not too soon. So you can see the difference here. When I had 12 items, it's kept that medium appearance. And when I have 10 items only, we have the full list in view. I was really excited to start thinking about rules in this way, and I can see many scenarios where this will be super powerful. So far, we've been working with container size queries. We got a little preview this morning that there's also style queries available. And this means computing or querying against the computed values of style properties. Just like style size queries, we cannot style the container itself. And the property you're querying for must exist on the container. So that's a little bit confusing. In this little snippet, we'll also note that the style query requires the actual style signifier to denote what type of query we would like to do. Now, instead of creating the quantity queries for the pagination component within the size query, we'll switch and define a custom property on the pagination container to be used for the style query. And interestingly, this can be part of the non-container query rules that we have for this element. I've picked the name show label because when this is true, we'll be showing the central pagination label instead of the pagination list. Now, we can't directly combine size and style queries, but we can nest the style query within the size query. And that's what I was mentioning. I expected that to happen. Yes, I have to kind of let this one run. It doesn't like stopping in between. So I'll just let this one run and talk about it. But this is important in terms of nesting, because just as before, we only want this to apply. Oh no, it's not going to run at all. I have to skip to the next one to show you the demo. But just like we only want this rule, when we do make the switch, to apply when we are above that certain range. So we have to kind of consider that interplay between your size queries, style queries, when one should apply, and when to keep the previous rules. And there's a little bit of massaging there for overrides, and I'm sorry that didn't work. We're at our last one. I don't know if I could get a time check, though. We're good? Okay. Make sure I have room to run through this last component. So we've arrived at our last one. It is a navigation component. And again, we see a few stages that we've planned based on the amount of available space. And it's a pretty common setup. We've got a logo, some primary links, and then off to the opposite side, some actions available. Once again, we're going to benefit from container size and style queries to manage that visibility. So to accomplish these views, let me also show a spec here. We're again going to take advantage of two named containers. One for our outer navigation component, named navigation, but also one for just that central area that includes our navigation links. We're going to call that one menu because of the switch to the menu dropdown at the lower sizes here. So an important part of our construction that's already in place for this component, if I can get myself over here, is in the setup for the layout here. I'm going to open up DevTools here. Let's give ourselves some more room. We already are using grid, our navigation, and the critical part here is that for our grid template columns, we're using 1FR for that central part. That's important because it's going to allow that area to behave independently of the outer navigation. It's going to act as its own container, and so we know, given that, we're going to be querying the right size to decide whether to show the menu or the inline links. Sorry. Close that out so we can do some updates here. All right, so in order for that to happen, we have our default styles in place. We're going to start enhancing this up, which actually means preparing it for the more narrow views. And the first thing that we don't have yet is actually defining containers. So we need to define both the navigation container and the menu container. This time we are using the shorthand of container. Important to note is the name goes first, and then a slash, and then the size. I learned this morning we can have multiple names in this definition, so that was new to me. Good thing to keep in mind as well. But for our first level, we're querying against the navigation container. And this intent is to have the brand name become visible. That's the change we're going to see. We previously used the same accessible label hiding technique as our pagination component. So there we go, we have Jabberwocky popped back on screen. And also note the use of the feature of media range syntax. So instead of min width, as might have used many, many times before, we're now looking for an inline size greater than or equal to 60 ch, which I appreciate thinking in that way now that that's available. The second stage is to reveal the link list and hide the menu button. And this is going to be based on the amount of space the menu-specific container has. And we have that in place. We're also using media queries again. Let's do a little test of seeing those respond. Maybe. So we get down to a size and back up again to reveal. Yay. That makes me really happy, actually. Now, depending on the length of the link list, we may have a similar problem as we had for pagination earlier. And while we would still need JavaScript to compute the actual dimension of the link list, we can again use a quantity query to sort of anticipate the space that we need to provide. So at present, our container size query for the menu container requires 80 ch of space. But we're going to add a quantity query to create a condition on whether or not to show the links with a list that has 6 or more items. And we'll be able to show that earlier if it's less than that. So if we have more than 6 items, we're going to set the property show menu to true. So with that, we'll be able to add one more container size query, and again, use a nested style query. And this time, we're going to actually use a comparison range, which is also super awesome. So we're providing both a upper and lower boundary for our media query range here to check if the inline size is between those bounds. Then, within that, we'll nest a style query. And these style queries are intended to keep the menu button hidden and the link list visible. So we'll actually include the not operator. And this means that the rule should not apply when the container, or should apply when the container does not meet the style query condition. So we're only switching to show the link list if we don't meet the condition, and that means we are under 6 items if we're meeting that condition. Now also note that we did keep that container size query for over 80 ch, so the one we previously did on the other page. If we didn't do that, then we would lose, it would prioritize the menu button again, flipping back to that other state. So we still have the other one we wrote in play. And we can kind of do a quick little test here. Since I had a menu that exceeded 5 items. We'll get in here. Let's see, I have 6, don't I? So let's drop 1. And, maybe I had miscounted there. Or don't have the right size. But we're showing the menu a little bit sooner. So we're showing it at this state. So if I bring back those 2 list items, we're hiding it again, because now we have more than items, and we need to wait for the larger range. Also pretty handy. I appreciate it takes a minute to wrap your mind around how that's all working, but it's fun to play with. Now, since container queries enable independent layout adjustments, we can also use them to help with the WCAG criterion for reflow. And this means supporting desktop zoom up to 400%, giving a minimum resolution of 1280 pixels. Sorry, I forgot to close DevTools there. And while we don't have a zoom media query, we can use container queries and regular media queries. They're going to affect this range as it approaches 320 pixels of inline space. That's what it computes to at that high zoom level. So we can kind of test that out with our media query. I'll just go ahead and increase. We'll see that nicely adjust, just as we saw from resizing the actual browser. So that's 300 and that's 400. I really like this because it shows the advantage of container queries against some uses of media queries, where traditionally media queries have been tied to predefined breakpoints that are based on device sizes. We really need to break out of that idea of thinking about the online space. And often those breakpoints fail at the in-between areas. We might think of it for devices, but it might also be split screen usage, or as we just saw, a Zoom scenario. I have 2 more slides. So this is just really quickly the support of the features. This is updated as of last night, which was great because it slipped text wrap, now is an edge as well. And I just wanted to note that a lot of what we looked at today were progressive enhancements. We saw how we considered our components from a baseline set of features that worked prior to container queries. They weren't ideal, but they worked. It's definitely important to consider the real users accessing your application, and you might decide you would like to support more features and include more fallbacks, whether that is having fallbacks to viewport units or maybe using some more classes to fill in until has a bit better support. Project that I had recently was, if I can get it to go, support css.dev. If you're wondering how to do feature detection, it has a big table on there. It also has a little script that acts like modernizer, if that rings any bells, sorry. Okay, last one. And here's your takeaway. So it's a good one to end on. Here is why I chose the demos for you today. Thoughtful usage of container queries, has, and other modern CSS features can make your components and layouts more resilient across unknown conditions, whether those conditions are device size, user capabilities, or context only an AI bot could dream up. And remember, there is no need to use everything new right away. But it is beneficial to come to CSS Day and consume other media to learn about what is available so that you can confidently craft a resilient solution. And these are the high-level things we went over: layers and nesting, accent color, color scheme. We did some grid utilities, a lot on has. Your key there is element presence, container size queries for contextual reflow, and container style queries for toggling layout conditions. Thank you so much for having me. Hello. Maybe. Okay.
Yeah, this is fun.
Awkward stools.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was absolutely incredible to see how all these new modern CSS features can be built, can be used to build actual practical components. And I think it kind of leads nicely from the question that Miriam got earlier about, like, what are the kind of practical examples where we can see these container queries and all these things used. And yeah, I mean, you just built that. So that was a great example. We are slightly over time, and I've been told we have time for one question, and we have like 20 questions to choose from. So I'm going to have to choose really super carefully.
I'll be upstairs too.
Okay, so there were a couple of questions. I don't know if this is the best one out of all of them, but there were a couple of questions about focus visible and focus within and has focus and has focus visible, which is an interesting one because it kind of gets a bit confusing there, right? Yes. So do we need focus within anymore because we have has focus? Is that needed
that's an interesting question. I think it depends on your use case. If your intent is to style the parent, focus within is awesome. It's a one-liner. That's what its intent is to do, directly style the parent. You would probably use has focus if you're doing something else, styling adjacent siblings or something more complex, or styling children other than the element that actually has focus.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I guess that
yeah.
makes sense. And there was another one about, sorry, this is part of the same question, kind of. So with focus within, you're not so with focus within, you're not matching focus visible. So should focus within be replaced with has focus visible? I guess they do kind of different things, because focus visible is whether you want that focus to be, displayed to everyone versus like
Yeah, good question. I'd have to fact check. I think focus within would detect both cases, because an element with focus visible also has focus. So I guess the key is remembering focus within, you're directly styling the parent. You're using that to look in to the element and see if a child has a state of focus. Hopefully that helps.
Well, thank you. And yeah, like that, as I say, there were tons more questions. So if you do have more questions, you can come and find Steph and Uma, and who was the previous speaker? It was Steph and Uma up in the Google Help Desk during the break time. So once more, please, round of applause for Stephanie.
Thank you.